Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica podcast network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Géraud from the beautiful island of Mauritius. Very good morning to you, Geraud.
Good morning, Eric.
Geraud, over the years on this program, and it's been an area of interest for us, we've been following a lot of the illicit flows of money and resources between China and Africa. So we've talked in the past a lot about the illegal rosewood trade, illegal mining in the DRC, illegal weapons that flow from China or other countries into Africa. And all of this contributes to some of the instability that we see, particularly in countries like your own in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In many ways, this is the kind of, you lift up the rock, this is what's underneath the rock in the China-Africa relationship that oftentimes doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
Yes, because over the years, when you talk about all those topics, you start to have a trend of thinking or a trend of conversation where people are trying to understand if having China's presence in those space, China's presence is creating or fueling instability in those regions. We had comment and debate about, for example, having Chinese in the Eastern DRC, where the region is unstable. Are those Chinese presence, are this Chinese presence there somehow fueling instability in those regions? You had the case of Mozambique, where Chinese are also some Chinese are also trading illegal rosewood in a region where you have rebels and instability. You also had those kind of debate where people were questioning all of that. So when you have China's weapon finding itself somewhere in the DRC, in Rwanda, in Uganda, people start also asking whether China is playing a role into fueling conflict. So basically, when you have all those elements all coming together, it's rightfully so that you're going to have some people trying to draw a conclusion, or people in decision makers in certain spaces trying to say, there is a connection or not. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that it's coming part of the debate that you have to be paying careful attention to, because you want to make sure that there is intent or coordination or there is anything behind that you can really pinpoint and to say China is responsible, because there's also an easy shortcut that people can take to say, because you have Chinese presence there, it means that China as a country, as a government, is behind all of this.
Yes, and so that's the key question here, is that when we see illegal mining in Nigeria or in the DRC or elsewhere, illegal logging in the Republic of Congo, or as you've talked about, the weapons trade, is that something that is done by nefarious actors who are operating independently, or is it something that is being coordinated or supported or tacitly supported by the Chinese government? What is your quick take? And we're going to dive into this in your conversation today that you have, but let's just kind of lay it out there. What do you see when you hear those types of accusations?
You don't have a strong body of evidence connecting those illegal activities with the Chinese government as a state, as entities. And you have a case, for example, in the case of Eastern DRC, where in January this year, the Chinese ambassador in the DRC himself made a statement by saying there's no legal Chinese company operating in the eastern part of the DRC, and urging the DRC government, if you do arrest the Chinese operating them, please arrest them, trial them, and let us know. This is it. And you also have those different statements coming from different Chinese embassy in Ghana or in Nigeria. You have all those statements out there. So it's really hard to have, you don't have a strong body of evidence, as I was saying, to say they are connecting to Chinese state. You have a lot of Chinese individuals, given how China has become now entrenched into China, in Africa relationship, in Africa trade and economics. It's unavoidable that you're going to have Chinese businessmen, individual being there, and among them being illegal ones and legal ones and all of that. Yeah, I think you even remember, if you remember that a few years back, Uganda had an operation with Chinese police to arrest a Chinese mob mafia in Uganda, and something also happened in Nigeria. So you have much more Chinese individual operating in those spaces, taking advantage, than having a case where you have a governmental support. Of course, there is a nuances to bring in that conversation, because in the case of illegal logging in the DRC, there was a case where we had one of the Chinese company operating on the ground was a subsidiary of a state-owned Chinese mining company, a state-owned Chinese logging company in China. So that where you have sometimes certain nuances in certain cases, but overall, when you look at the overall picture, you cannot come government say we have strong body of evidence to say, yes, you have Chinese government support behind those activities.
Yeah, there's not much evidence there. And I'm glad you brought up this question of what the ambassadors say. The Chinese ambassador to Ghana, Ambassador Tong Defa, in fact, earlier this year came out and said to the Ghanaians that if Chinese miners are acting illegally, arrest them.
Exactly.
And prosecute them. This is not a question of us, the embassy or the Chinese government, defending the actions of illegal Chinese miners in Ghana or elsewhere. And we hear that consistently across the continent, that if Chinese are violating the laws, then the embassies say, prosecute
arrest them, yes.
Now we run into a different problem, though, is that the governance and the prosecutorial process in many of these countries is quite weak.
Yeah.
And so as a result, people get frustrated when they see the Chinese or others just walk away because either they have gotten a good lawyer or they bribed their way out of it or whatever. The system just does not work.
Or most of the time they have a strong local politician, so political support behind them, making them, helping them to get out. I remember I had a conversation with the Chinese diplomats telling me, what do you want me to do? What do you want us to do in a context where you arrest someone and yourself, you have a politician in general going to the court and say, release that person. So what do you want me as a diplomat here to do in these cases? So you have those kind of situations also where you have the responsibility of local law enforcement and politicians in all those kind of situations where Chinese are released after the fact.
Well, there was an interesting article that came out a couple of weeks ago by the Jamestown Foundation. Illicit PRC-linked finance enables arms diversion in Africa, and it brings up all of these issues that we are talking about. You had a chance to speak with the author, Adam Rousselle, who is the co-founder and chief analyst of Between the Lines Research. Set up the conversation that you had, because I recall that you and I, in advance of your conversation with Adam, you were a little bit skeptical about the article. But then when you had a chance to speak with Adam, he brought a lot of nuance to the conversation. But talk about the skepticism that you went into this conversation with.
Yes, I was really skeptical when I was approaching this conversation. It was one of those things when you prepare the interview, you realize that, wow, I'm afraid to be sounding, very on the defensive here, trying to push back and becoming confrontational. Given when I was reading the article, I had the feeling there was a lot of shortcuts taken into how things were presented, into how connection were made into one cases in the Eastern DRC, creating a whole situation where we have a generalization of the situation. We have a situation where in Nigeria of cryptocurrency and making it a whole situation where you have a connection with the arm deals with UAE, and especially when you have now Chinese weapons coming from the UAE but landing in Sudan, and you have now a kind of sense. You had a sense where the article was creating a connection between China and the UAE and China and the Sudan's conflict and providing all of that. I was like really looking at it like, nah, this is not really, there's something really kind of wrong. Or the feeling I had, there's really something wrong in this conversation. And fortunately, I was really pleasantly surprised when I talked with Adam Rousselle. It was really a very vibrant conversation because it brought the nuances, and that allowed me to understand. It was like, okay, I understand better what you wanted to say and the idea behind. So yeah, it was much more nuanced conversation that the article itself can give you the feeling the feeling or the impression that you are reading, the conclusion that you are having there.
Well, let's take a listen now to your conversation with Adam Rousselle about his article, Illicit PRC-Linked Finance Enables Arms Diversion in Africa, that was featured in the Jamestown Foundation website, and we have a link to that in the show notes. But then let's take a listen now to your conversation.
Adam, thank you and welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, Geraud. Thank you for having me.
So let's dive deep into the conversation. So can you walk us through briefly on how you got into your main thesis and how you got into look into and try to understand, explore the link between Chinese national illicit financial flow and conflict economies in Africa? And what do you think? And that connection tells us about the future, about China-Africa relation and the evolution of conflict in Africa.
Sure. That's a lot to unpack. When I wrote this article, I wrote it as a follow-up to something I wrote last year that was cited in a report by the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee It was about rosewood smuggling and its fueling of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. This follow-up is based on new evidence that's surfaced and kind of builds on it a little bit. What I want to acknowledge first is that there's a lot we don't know. We don't know the exact mechanisms through which these things happen. I want to say clearly that there's no evidence that, of course, that the Chinese government is involved in this. That there's no evidence specifically that we even have a coordinated effort across these conflict zones between the criminal actors involved. What I have found is a preponderance of evidence to indicate that actors from China are facilitating these conflicts in a way that is opportunistic and ultimately fueling them. And that based on analyses I've conducted in other parts of the world, specifically Southeast Asia, the likelihood of convergence is very high. And this is something to watch very closely. Right now, financial enforcement is just starting to catch up in Southeast Asia. We just had the world's largest cryptocurrency seizure of $15 billion by FinCEN in Cambodia. None of that is possible without deep research on the ground and a lot of analysis. And what I'm hoping to do is to spark more conversations about this part of the world. So that's kind of a bit of a background on what the article is, what it is not, and what I hope it will achieve.
That's really interesting. So can you tell us what have you found? What have you described in your article? Because many of photos and readers haven't read the articles. Can you walk us briefly on what was the point that you developed in your articles?
So I started off with a recent court case that came to fruition after I'd written the first article about 3 Chinese nationals being actually charged in a Congolese court for illicit gold smuggling. They mentioned they had an amount of gold bars. They didn't say the exact quantity or value of the bullion. And they had $400,000 in cash. And that's nothing new from an anecdotal perspective. Locals have been complaining about illicit Chinese actors on the ground in that part of the world in the Eastern Congo for many years. What is new is that an actual judicial case was brought forth. And what we have now is evidence of these actors acting in this way, in addition to an ongoing conflict in the region that has some very interesting links to China that are indirect. We know, or at least we have very strong evidence, despite the denials involved, that Rwanda is backing the M23 movement in the Kivu conflict. And strong evidence also suggests that Uganda is. We also know that these rebels have been outfitted extensively with Chinese weapons. Now, that's not to say the Chinese are arming them. The Chinese sell vast quantities of weapons to both Rwanda and Uganda. And given what the rebels are pilfering out of mines in the region, such as cobalt, gold, coltan, China is the natural endpoint. We don't have a causal link saying, okay, M23 is moving it to Rwanda and then they're sending it out directly to China. But there's enough of a global gravitational pull in that direction that says China's the endpoint. And so I'm very careful in how I worded that article because of the nuance there. But again, my hope is that we spark more investigation into this. In another example, I drew on there were dozens of Chinese criminals operating in the vast cryptocurrency economy of Nigeria that were rounded up in a series of arrests. And again, when you look at the nature of stable coins and the nature of illicit finance, the fact that we have so many Chinese nationals involved in a completely different continent, in a critical resource economy, tells us that this is worthy of further investigation. And then, of course, in the final component, I talk about how we are seeing the current embargo on Chinese arms exports being evaded, and these weapons ending up in the Sudan conflict, again, different theater, and that we know through investigations that Dubai is a central node in this. And Dubai serves or the Emirates, I should say, not just Dubai, has served as a central node and also the commodity extraction and how it ends up back in China. So again, what I am not saying is that we have any indication the Chinese government is involved or that all of the criminals involved are colluding, but that the opportunities are presenting themselves, and that this tells us a lot about the nature of involvement in the region as a whole and warrants further investigation.
The nuance that you brought is very interesting when you say that there is no proof so far that we can establish there is a connection between those individuals, or if there is a network of individuals, or if there is a coordinated effort that connect those people with the Chinese government and all of that. It's very important because it really allows us to ask the question about intent, about accountability, and of course, as from an African perspective, to try to understand if action needs to be made, where the point of action could be. Because if the framing is not correct, people tend to believe that, it's China related, China government, and people are gonna be pointing on fingers on the Chinese government, where Chinese government is going to react by saying, nah, it's not us, it's individuals. And because you've mentioned that, it just reminded me early this year, the Chinese ambassador in the DRC were mentioning the fact that he was making a statement and he said there is no legal Chinese entity operating in the eastern part of the DRC. Basically telling Congolese official, if arrest any Chinese individual operating in that region, please arrest them, put them in jail, just arrest them, so in a way that we are not part of that conversation. And I really like that nuances, because people really will tend to like put China PRC linked individuals in a whole box. It's China's government behind all of that.
A lot of analysts, I've lived in China, and a lot of analysts that cover China, not all, and I'm very clear about that, but a lot tend to think of it as a monolith. That that the Xi Jinping says go do this, they go do that. To some degree, I mean, we see that in the way a 5-year plan is conducted, but even in that, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of agency, and so. The best way to understand, how China exports influences is that it's networked, that, it's a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. And so it's of course, exactly. Yeah. And when you have that level of nuance, it's very difficult to prove anything from an evidentiary perspective that leads all the way back. I'm more interested in liquidity and the flow thereof. Where is it coming? Where is it going? And how can it be disrupted in a way that benefits humanity? Because if liquidity is flowing in a way that's killing people in conflict, then it's immaterial to me where it comes and where it goes in terms of countries, but rather that it be stopped. And so that's where I'm kind of focusing my efforts. And of course, when the flows link to one country, that's where I'm I'm most concerned.
Yeah. Let's break down a few of the components that you mentioned in your paper. In the case of, let's go back in South Kivu, because I'm basically from the DRC, and the South Kivu is really that's my native space. And that case is really interesting because we've been following that case for quite some time. We've been really following the presence of Chinese illegal gold smugglers in that region, and how Chinese embassies have been reacting to their presence there, and how Congolese authorities also have been reacting. There was a case a few years back where there was a conflict between the provincial government and national government over how to treat the Chinese nationals that were involved in those situations. In your paper, you mentioned those cases in South Kivu. From my understanding, the Chinese were not in the specific region where the rebellions were happening when they were arrested at that time. But what we know we know that there was a lot of official involvement, lot of local politicians, local military officers being involved with those Chinese present in those cases. So when I read your paper, I was like, my feeling was like, where do we put the responsibility? Where's the part of local agency and local responsibility in those contexts where beside the Chinese, you also have other stakeholders, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Lebanese, also taking advantage of all that context, of that situation because of corruption, because of lack of governance.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that it ultimately does come down to a matter of local agency and dealing with the vast global problem of corruption. And this is not at all an Africa-centric issue. We've had issues in the developed world of politicians being co-opted and officials being co-opted by dark money, and particularly related to Chinese crime. We've had we have an ongoing issue in Southeast Asia with regard to it. But I think the judicial case was very interesting. And of course, evidence suggests that Kinshasa put a lot of pressure on the case locally due to its concerns over sovereignty and the ongoing insurgency. So it is possible. I think it requires external assistance from global regulators. We're dealing with a transnational issue, and so the level of responsibility that is local is important, but it's not the endpoint either. It requires a networked response to a networked problem.
And so in this case, when you look into those kind of situations, what could be the action that a Chinese official can be taking to tackle those kind of issues led by those individuals on the ground? Because that's really something, at some point, many African governments have been complaining about the fact that we have Chinese nationals here, either we arrest them, either we send them back, and this is a very also interesting point where you notice that African officials arresting Chinese individuals, and instead of putting them in jail in African countries, they tend to send them back to China for reasons that we still don't understand. And this is a very tricky situation. So what could be the level of responsibility of Chinese government in those kind of situations, if there is any kind of responsibility at all?
I think that the Chinese government is concerned about illicit behaviors of its citizens abroad. It's actually even issued warnings, I mentioned in the paper, to Chinese citizens operating in specifically the mining sector in the region. In this one case, when we see an extradition back to China, I mean, unless there's real desire to save face, which is, essential to the Chinese system and Chinese culture as a whole, unless there's sufficient pressure, I would suspect that those extraditions would go unpunished, and you might see those people turn up in different countries.
Let's move on the last portion of your paper. That really also I found really interesting. Of course, the weapon part. It's really interesting to us because we've covered that a few weeks back in the China Global South, where we see a much more, and even AFP mentioned that we are seeing more and more Chinese weapons landing in the conflict in Sudan. And of course, they're not coming straight from China. They're coming from UAE, and they're finding themselves in Sudan. But in that case, I'm gonna push a bit again against the whole narrative that I've seen, not on your paper, not only on your paper, but other papers as well, where the connection made through Saudi Arabia tends to kind of overlook the fact that Chinese made manufacture doesn't mean Chinese supply. It doesn't mean that there is kind of intent on that Chinese are supplying on that. Otherwise, we would have the case where people are going to ask, you have AK-47 coming out of Ukraine, coming out of Russia, and you have AK-47 coming out of Turkey. Does it mean that you have those involvement? So can you enlighten us on that, on those kind of cases that we see of Chinese PRC weapon landing in those, in that space?
So I want to just, there's a lot of nuance in the paper that I wrote, but I want to articulate it as clearly as I can, that I don't see China as this, purposeful, malevolent force in this instance, but rather more like a leaky bucket, right? That you have all these networks coming out of there, they're leaking money, and they're leaking goods into conflicts that in a way that's illegal. We know for sure that the export of Chinese weapons to these conflicts is illegal. And so that we can say. Now, I'm not implicating the manufacturers themselves. We know that China is the largest legitimate supplier of weapons to Africa. And I mean, there's ethical considerations, but there was ethical considerations when the French or the Americans were too.
Exactly.
Or the Russians.
Yeah. The Turkish. Anyone, yeah.
Right. And we also know that, if we want to really point fingers anywhere, the Emiratis are the ones that, are bearing a lot of the responsibility. They're the ones treating the RSF in a field hospital across the border from Darfur. They're the ones that are benefiting most from the gold flows, them and the Russians. And they're facilitated through Emirati financial institutions. The world is very very careful with how it treats the Emirates because it's such a global entrepot for energy flows and finance. And so I think again, we don't even want to point necessarily fingers at the Emirati government in this because, again, you're dealing with nuance here. But if I had to guess, I would say that the Emiratis are purchasing Chinese weapons illegally so that they're not using the American weapons that are supplied to them and thus implicating their partners in DC and exporting them to the conflict in various ways. That would be my guess. Again, the evidence is limited in this regard. But the fact of the matter is that these weapons are getting there. And it's not just in Sudan. We're seeing like JNIM in Mali increasingly outfitted with Chinese weapons. In fact, I have a friend who's a weapons expert, and he has this strange ability where I can send him any photo, and within 30 seconds, he can tell me exactly the make and model of every single weapon that's being held. And just the sheer percentage of them, the overwhelming percentage of the weapons you see in the attacks that are of Chinese manufacture is quite astounding, given that China is also the end market for the things that JNIM exports illegally. Again, it's not
a causal relation, yeah. Yeah.
It's not a direct causal relation, but rather it's the leaky bucket scenario where we have an end market for goods, a source of money that's flowing in, and a on the ground example of weapons coming from that exact same end market, which provides us with a lot of things to chew on and a lot of things to consider. Again, causal link is not there. We may be able to prove it with enough evidence or enough research, but right now what I'm trying to do is to raise the points and to spark conversations about how to deal with this issue. And
the element that you mentioned in terms of ethical element just made me think of one of the criticism, I think the legitimate criticism that we have to make that we can put against China could be the responsibility in terms of to make sure that weapons that it sells on a legitimate basis to different countries are really used for security purposes and not to fuel conflict anywhere else. The reality is China is not the same way that East Europe is. East Europe has been for so many years the market for all old weapons coming from Soviet weapons, AK-47. Illegitimate actors could go straight to those regions without needing any kind of government support to acquire those weapons. The reality when it comes to Chinese made manufacture, because China doesn't have an illegal market of that, those weapons are coming from legitimate stockpile from other government buying those weapons from Chinese officials, like normal trade kind of deal, buying those weapons on a legitimate basis. But then those government become those one reselling those weapons for different purposes, either to finance rebels somewhere and to kind of act on someone else. So on some other countries. And of course, people can argue in that regard, if that's found, if that's proven, Beijing should and maybe could be more assertive toward those government by saying, you know what, I don't feel comfortable seeing you using the weapon I sell you on a legitimate basis, using them to go and fuel other conflict elsewhere. And I think this is the point where people could be using a point of pressure to say, China, we like you or we don't like you, whatever, but we'd appreciate if you could be much more careful on what your other government are doing with the weapons that you're selling to them.
Yeah. But I mean, that kind of contradicts Beijing's way of interacting with the world, where they say
policies, yes.
We don't judge in the way that the West does. But we're seeing, the ramifications of that manner of interaction coming about. With the Eastern European example too, we were also, particularly in the 1990s, that flow of old Soviet weapons was born of a vacuum of governance. We were dealing with new countries whose governments were just finding their way, and a lot of things happened completely outside of their control. China is, the way it presents itself is meant to be different. But I think that there is, critical similarities in this regard, where, we do know that, for example, one of the largest arms manufacturers in the country, Norinco, which has produced most of the weapons that I've seen in these conflicts, that their top leadership has been subjected to several purges in the past few years by the Central Committee. We've seen former company leaders go to prison. We've seen court cases brought about them over graft and corruption, not related to overseas dealings, but noteworthy nonetheless.
I mean, you're making good point there, and I really wanted to look into those points because the nuances are really interesting and important to bring in those conversation. And especially, and my feeling when I was, frankly, when I was reading your report, I was kind of puzzled at the end. I was like, is there any connection that we are building in this paper, or I'm not perceiving the nuances? I'm really happy that you provide the nuances compared to when I was reading the paper. That really helped me to understand better your views on those points.
I'm glad you brought that up because, with editorial constraints, what I wanted was to just put as much evidence in there as possible and spark this exact kind of conversation. I've written elsewhere that, the world, we see illicit finance as completely uncontrollable, but as regulations unfold and as AI technology gets better, we are getting enforcement's getting stronger. And in this regard, the kind of analysis that I'm producing here is trying to help train those systems as they come online, to train this generation of professionals looking at illicit finance and surfacing as much evidence as possible so that further links can be established as time goes on. And as, local people start to see, okay, well, we have this, and this, what if we connect this kind of thing? It's meant to spark a conversation in an area where I just don't think there's enough going on. And I'm glad that you saw right to the heart of it in that paper.
Thank you very much, and I hope that our listeners understand the context of your paper and the nuances that needs to be brought on that. And I'm really, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning, my hope is to see the Chinese government being much more involved in those kind of situations and really show itself being more present into helping local law enforcement to tackle those kind of issues. Because the more you have Chinese national being present there, the more you see Chinese weapons circulating in those areas, the more it's becoming a reputational issue, and they're gonna have to act on that. They're not gonna have just to sit on the sideline saying, no, it's not me, it's them. But at some point, they're gonna have to take a stand on that and take position. And thank you for being my guest in this conversation. I'm gonna remind people the title of your paper: Illicit PRC Linked Finance Enables Armed Diversion in Africa. It was written by Adam Rousselle and China Brief's note at the Jamestown Foundation. And I'm going to put the link in the show notes so can people read your work. And where people can follow you on social media if they want to know more about the work that you're producing and the analysis that you're producing, where they can find you on LinkedIn, on X, or where?
They can look at Between the Lines Research. They can just Google that, or www.btl-research.com. We've got a solid community going around the kind of questions I'm raising. I'm always happy to see new people, new faces, new voices, and just interact.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Géraud, absolutely fascinating conversation with Adam. Really enjoyed it. Again, I agree with you that the conversation had a lot more texture to it than the article. So I highly recommend people both to read the article, but also to then actually listen to what Geraud had to say. Let me just ask you a question. I have a problem with some of these kind of characterizations of the Chinese, in part because it lacks the context of how the Chinese compare to others. It makes it sound like the Chinese are in some way exceptional here. But when we look in Ghana and we see who is doing a lot of the illegal mining, the majority of the arrests that the military is making are Nigerians and other West Africans. The Chinese are certainly there. But when you look at it in the context, the Chinese are one player among many operating in these environments.
In these spaces, yeah.
In these spaces, and we don't have any sense of proportion. Are they more? Are they less? I certainly know from my time, the brief time that I lived in the DRC, that the Lebanese were very active in some of these spaces. The Nigerians were also there. Obviously, we've got Dan Gertler, who's the Israeli.
Yeah.
Lots of Europeans have been in these spaces. The South Africans don't have the cleanest hands in a lot of these areas. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of proportion. What's your understanding, at least in the DRC, of how the Chinese factor against these other populations?
It's really going to be difficult to be able to come to it with a number or with a proportion or whether Chinese are big or small or anything. So what we can say for sure is the fact that when you look at the relationship between China and those countries, you're going to have more and more Chinese individuals in those spaces, being legal or illegal. And of course, because of bad governance or weak governance in many of those countries, you're gonna have opportunistic Chinese businessmen who are gonna come and say, let's take advantage of bad governance in those countries, and we can now make a quick buck and make it easy business for us. And this is the part where, because of that, you can expect to see more in Chinese here and there. And it also depends on the spaces, of course. When you talk to mining activities in copper and cobalt, you can find more Chinese. But when you talk about financial crimes somewhere else, still in the DRC, you may find less Chinese there because you have much more other presence of other nationalities there. So when you look at all of that, it's just only, as you say, to put it in a context of the whole environment of those countries in terms of governance, in terms of like law and order, in terms of like policies and politics and all of that, to understand exactly when I'm dealing here, do I have a general cases or do I have a much more isolated situation? But the fact of the matter is, we are seeing more and more arrests happening on the ground in many African countries. Not later than 10 days ago, we had a case in Ethiopia where Chinese were among many arrested for criminal financial activities in Ethiopia. They were like, illegal trading of US dollars and all those financial activities. You have more and more those cases taking place here and there. But as we were saying in the beginning, you cannot come and say you have a coordinated approach or we have a governmental support behind all those activities. But yes, we should be expecting more and more Chinese. But in terms of compared to others, it's still going to be difficult to have a straight, clear numbers, because even compared to others, local authorities do not always arrest those people. So yeah, you don't have a general population numbers to be able to evaluate them with.
I think that's the biggest takeaway from the conversation that you had with Adam, is that a lot of people, particularly in the US and Europe, will conflate PRC, CCP, Chinese, the state, the actions of individuals, and they will put them all together as one. So when you'll see illegal mining happening in the Kivus, for example, in the eastern DRC, that, again, the Chinese embassy, as you pointed out over and over again, and you spoke with the former Chinese ambassador to Kinshasa, even on this topic, they'll say, listen, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We've told them to leave over and over again, to the point where we've even said that if you don't leave after a certain deadline, we're not going to be able to help you. And I find that many of these illegal actors in various African countries oftentimes turn out to be more of a pain in the ass for the embassy than actually anything that's part of some coordinated grand plan. These actors who are conducting illicit, financial, logging, mining, weapons trades, oftentimes create to the very instability that China, the government, doesn't want.
Exactly.
China, the government, wants stability because stability is better for business.
Exactly.
Or at least for the kind of business that the Chinese do, which is large infrastructure, lending, Belt and Road type of things. So I get a little frustrated when I see the conversation kind of conflate the actions of a PRC or Chinese national with somehow being part of the Chinese government, which is kind of ridiculous.
Exactly. And this is where people need to understand why, for example, why the Chinese embassies in Africa will always be in a tough spot in those situations. Because we have the case where, as I've mentioned in the beginning, Chinese are arrested because they have local support of politicians and military office and everything. Those Chinese are going to be released, but the public opinion do not understand, as those Chinese were supported by local politicians, political leaders and militaries and all of that. So at the end, when they see them released, there is a shortcut by saying they've been released because China's and Chinese embassy here put pressure on our government to release them because our government does not want to have a bad relationship with China. They do not factor in that our own bad governance. They do not factor in our own weak law and order situation. They do not factor all of that. So it becomes like a very shorthand, a very shortcut. Say, yeah, they got released because China's embassy put pressure on our government. That's why they got released. But in many of those cases, you're gonna find out that no, they had nothing to do. The Chinese embassy just discovered, like anybody, that's like, yeah, we arrested 10 Chinese in this place and they got released. Okay, what do you want to do?
Okay, well, let's leave the conversation there. Obviously, a lot going on. We're going to talk next week. We'll bring Cobus on to talk about Lee's visit to Zambia, the G20. We're going to get Géraud and Cobus's take. We'll do a roundtable on that one. So much, obviously, going on. This always happens at the end of the year where everything just kind of ramps up. By the way, we have some fantastic shows also lined up with researchers at the Rhodium Group and AidData about new reports that they've just released as well. So keep an eye out for those show. So a lot to talk about. Géraud, thank you as always for your time and your insights. Always appreciated. And want to remind everybody that if you'd like to support the work that Géraud does, Cobus, and the entire team at CGSP, the best way to do it is to go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com and then check out our site and also sign up to receive our daily newsletter and get full access to the site. Subscriptions are very affordable. And if you are a student or a teacher, don't forget, you get half off. We just signed up a whole bunch of students from Georgetown, University of Chicago, Williams College. So we're very excited to have our growing student readership. So thank you to all of you. Email me, Eric, E-R-I-C, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for the half off discount rate. Make sure to send it to me from your school account. So that'll do it for the latest edition of the China and Africa podcast. Cobus, Géraud, and myself will be back again next week with another episode. Until then, thank you so much for listening and for watching.